Humphrey Lyttelton was a giant in the jazz world and regarded by many as the finest trumpet player of his generation.
He is unquestionably my hero, but I will remember him with colossal affection because everything I learned in jazz music, I learned from Humphrey Lyttelton.
A band leader for 60 years, he inspired and motivated all who worked with him.
I think he instinctively knew how to get the best out of each individual musician and out of the band in general. How he did it, I'm not quite sure, but he did it. And you always wanted to play your best for Humphrey.
Known as a gentleman in every sense of the word, he was held in deep affection throughout his long and varied career.
I suppose there are a few people who you would find in life who nobody would say a bad word against. And I think that Humph not only would be one of those, but you would also get a great deal of people saying what a fantastic man he was.
That was one of his great strengths. He reached out all over the place to people who weren't necessarily jazz fans. They were Humph fans.
He's the jazz musicians panel game chairman. Mr. Humphrey Lyttelton!
Humphrey Lyttelton was more than just a jazz man. He was also a radio broadcaster and chairman of the infamous panel game show I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue.
There was the jazz he was fantastic at. There was Clue he was fantastic at. There was his radio show that he was fantastic at. There wasn't really any bump with Humph.
Oh, I'm sorry. There appears to be a problem. I've just received this note from Samantha to say she's been delayed meeting a gentleman beekeeper friend near Warrington. Samantha's just started keeping bees herself and has 36 or so, and she says her friend's an expert handler. Apparently he carefully takes out her 38 bees, and so and soon has them flying round his head.
Humphrey Lyttelton, the well-known Old Etonian ex-Guards officer and jazz trumpeter, was born on May the 23rd, 1921. Born into an aristocratic family, he had a privileged upbringing.
Warhouse, where we lived in Eton, was a huge sort of barrack of a house, and we had a nanny. And I think before my day, there was a nursery maid as well. It was a very old-fashioned sort of country house upbringing, really.
Sent away to Sunningdale School when he was 8, he graduated to Eton at 11, where his father, the Honourable George Lyttelton, was English master.
He was quite an emotional child, I think. Hated going away to school. Well, so much so that Mr. Vickery, who was always known as the odd man, but he did all the necessary jobs around the garden and house and everything, and he used to have to take Humph to school so that there wasn't a terrible drama at the other end.
Humph described his family as family with a capital F. But perhaps it was F as in female that had such an influence over him growing up, with 4 sisters to contend with.
I think he was very shy. He grew up with 4 sisters, and he has described how they would bring their rather hearty friends home, and he would just, as soon as he got his first bicycle, he was on it, and he was out of the house and gone.
Humph, however, did have a male ally in childhood, his cousin Anthony Lyttelton, with whom he was able to indulge in schoolboy pranks and mischief.
One of my early memories of Humph was the heffalump trap that he and Anthony Lyttelton dug for my unsuspecting and rather unpopular nanny. But they dug this pit at Harlech Beach where we used to go every year and disguised it with a towel on top and sprinkled it with sand over the top of that. And this poor woman came along carrying 2 picnic baskets and disappeared into the pit. Needless to say, she was furious, but she made the great mistake of trying to chase these 2 very lithe, rather skinny teenage boys over the sand dunes, and she didn't succeed. But I'm glad to say that she left soon after that. So he was my hero from then on.
Although musical as a child, it was as a teenager that Humph's passion for jazz began. And in 1936, when he was just 15, his mother broke school rules and traditions to buy him his first trumpet.
My mother certainly nurtured his interest in music, and it was her that reneged on the cricket match at Lord's and took him off to buy his trumpet, which must have been quite a surprise to the shop, because he arrived in top hat and tails, which was the Eton boys' uniform, and arrived in Charing Cross Road, I think it was, or Denmark Street, I imagine, to buy this trumpet.
Eton naturally favoured classical music over jazz, but this did little to dissuade Humph from the music of his idols, Louis Armstrong and British jazz artist Nat Gonella.
I'm gonna wash my hands of you. You're never gonna blemish my pretty hands anymore. When you got me in your power, your kisses turn all sour. Oh, I'm gonna wash my hands of you. Hit out!
In the war, in order to get a new record, as they were then called, you had to produce an old one to be melted down, and then you were allowed to have a new one. And I had a very favourite record, which was called On My Little Toboggan in Switzerland. And he pinched my record and took it up to Dyson's, the music shop on Windsor Hill, to be melted down so that he could get his new Nat Gonella. I never quite forgave him for that.
In 1940, Humph and his cousin Anthony were sent through a family connection to gain management experience at a steel mill in South Wales.
Humph spent some time as a young man in Port Talbot, which is where I'm from, and, he used to talk to me about that. I think it was a kind of work experience thing, He came from this very privileged background, but it's my understanding that that time in Port Talbot turned him into this sort of very romantic socialist.
But rather than becoming a suit, Humph was more interested in learning the trade and making friendships on the shop floor.
He was classless, really, in his friends, completely. I mean, it wouldn't have occurred to him. People were people, and he became very friendly with anyone. It didn't matter to him what the background was.
Their time in South Wales soon ended. In 1943, the cousins, now in the Grenadier Guards, were called up to fight, but both were to have short military careers. Anthony was killed a year later, whilst Humph was discharged on medical grounds, suffering from malaria, jaundice and dysentery.
When Humph came back from being abroad, he was quite ill and was in mentally quite a bad state, because I think, a lot of people were, and he was quite ill for some time. And I think it gave him time to think about what he'd been through and everything, and what other people had been through. I think it was an experience probably that he was glad he'd had, but I think it did affect Humph, definitely.
Humph had recovered by the end of the war, and on VE Day he turned out with the masses to celebrate.
Well, the crowd, I can watch them up the mall. They're pouring into this great space in front of the forecourt, and there's a trumpet playing now somewhere down below me.
Taking his trumpet along with him, Humph treated the crowds to a memorable performance. By the time he was finally demobilised, 6 years had elapsed since he'd left school, and the war had changed both his outlook and ambitions.
I remember Humph saying that really his main interests were music and drawing. And so that was, with discussions, I think, with my father, that was what he thought that he would really enjoy doing.
And so he stepped off a well-worn career path for an old Etonian and enrolled instead at Camberwell Art College in South London.
He didn't rebelliously go against his upbringing, but his talents led him into this much more unconventional bohemian side.
It was whilst an art student that Humph began to play in jazz bands during his free time. The old Etonian, ex-guards officer, was on his way to becoming a well-known jazz trumpeter.
I was playing with a band called the George Webb Dixielanders, which started in '43, And we were playing at a concert, and Humph was the trumpet player in the other band. And we were so impressed with this giant, we tried to ensnare him. In fact, we did. We got him to join the Webb band. Looking back at it, I mean, it was rather like Gulliver's Travels, with Humph, this giant figure, coming into the land of the small people. And we tried to tie him up, but we didn't have enough string. And he broke free a year later and formed his own band, taking me with him.
But Wally Fawkes and Humph shared more than just a love of jazz. Both were keen cartoonists with a strong sense of humour.
Humph had a tremendous talent for drawing, and this sort of instant cartoons, which were very fashionable at that time, I think, in the sort of early 40s. He just got a likeness immediately. He had a great talent for that.
Then, through a mixture of good luck and what Humph coined the Young Pals Act, Humph got work on the Daily Mail, where Wally was employed as the cartoonist Trog.
Humph had a lot of fun on the Mail, with his sort of that sense of mockery and lampooning, and all these very self-important people that were running various departments were all grist to Humph's mill.
Soon, Humph and Wally were living life to the full, cartooning by day and playing in the band by night. In 1948, Humph got his lucky break when he was asked to perform at the International Jazz Festival in Nice. Wally went too, not as a band member, but as a journalist, having persuaded the Mail to let him cover the story.
They sent me out there, and it was very difficult for them to contact me because I was hanging about listening to the music all the time. But eventually they picked me up on the phone and forced a story out of me. They wanted to know about the British band and who was in it. I said, well, there's a trumpet player, an old Etonian trumpet player, Humphrey Lyttelton. What? Excitement. The wires buzzing. So that did it, quite accidentally. I launched Humph as a tabloid hero.
The late 1940s saw the beginnings of youth culture, and dancing clubs sprung up wherever they could. London was at the forefront of this craze, and jazz was the hot dance music that got young people bopping till they dropped.
I think it was in 1945 that the Feldman Club first opened its doors at 100 Oxford Street. It was run by the Feldman family. But sometime early in the 1950s, it became the Humphrey Lyttelton Club, and it was certainly the mecca for everybody who loved Humph. They came down to the club. Stars like Joan Collins came and danced in front of him. His band was hotter than Hades.
She was crazy about Humph, but he was totally unaware of this. I remember taking her out to lunch one day when I bumped into her in the Fleet Street, and she ruined her chances with me by talking non-stop about Humph.
3 times a week, I think it was, Mondays, Wednesdays and Saturdays. I was training to be a physio at St Thomas's by this time. And evening clinic, I used to look at my watch thinking, goodness, I must leave soon, I'll miss a bit of jazz club. But it was lovely, very exciting life, really.
My mother and father used to go to the 100 Club and see Humphrey Lyttelton playing. And the thing about certain sorts of jazz music, it can be like an aphrodisiac. It gets people dancing, acting involuntarily, and perhaps getting a little sort of flirtatious with one another. And that certainly happened with my parents. And so not long after seeing Humph and being driven on by his exciting playing, they went away, and then suddenly I appeared. And so maybe without Humph, if they'd have gone to see sort of Schubert piano recitals or some folk dancing, perhaps I might not have been born for another 2 years. Or at all. So, thanks, Humph.
So Humph, it seems, was not just responsible for entertaining a new generation of music lovers, he was perhaps responsible for creating one. However, as the decade was ending, a rift appeared in the jazz world. The split was between the traditionalist musicians, who championed the New Orleans music of the 20s, and the modern jazz players.
Although, to begin with, he was a totem of the traditional revival in the late 1940s, which was an extremely trendy and powerful musical movement. In fact, in the 50s, he moved away from that, rather to the horror. It's been forgotten now. But at the time, many of his fans and critics criticised him roundly for moving away from the revival into what we call mainstream jazz.
One of the things in 1950s Britain was that there were people who liked modern jazz, people who liked the traditional jazz, and they were quite divided. I think at Bewley, where they used to have a festival, there was actually riots between the two, like mods and rockers, you know. All very daft, really, because it's just all about the music. But Humph rose above all that because he loved elements from all sorts of music.
He was quietly rebellious, certainly. He would never go along with the trend, and if somebody said, oh, that can't be done, he'd say, oh, yes, it can, and he would certainly prove that it could be done.
So Humph's attitude to jazz was based on his passion for the music rather than the doctrines surrounding it. This non-conformity fueled him throughout his life and was summed up in his jazz memoir, I Play As I Please.
Somebody once called him waggish tradster, which he loved. He used to quote that on numerous occasions. He wasn't, of course. In the 50s, when people were adding banjos to their bands, Humphrey added another saxophone.
The saxophone was not considered a traditional instrument for a proper jazz band. When Humph invited the American alto player Bruce Turner to join his band in 1957, many felt that he'd taken a step too far.
Bruce Turner received some rather famous insults in his early years, including one at Birmingham Town Hall, where they raised a banner as soon as Bruce stepped forward to play a solo with Humph, which read, "Go home, dirty bopper." But Humph bravely swum out of the traditional into the mainstream, and he got a lot of flack.
But Humph was determined to play jazz the way he wanted.
I realised that he was out to go further, not to stay within the boundaries that were there, to create his own boundaries, if you like, that gradually stretched the range of music he was able to perform and the people who played it.
And rather than stop at a sax, Humph went further still by introducing female saxophonist Kathy Stobart to his band.
With music, it doesn't matter about people's backgrounds, really. It's the music that they play and the way they play it, and whether they mean it when they play it, and whether they play what they mean, you know, and whether there's truth in what they're doing. And you don't have to be an expert to spot that in someone's playing. You go, oh, that's great, that just gets me going, that just touches the spot, that somebody does that, you know. And he had that.
From where Humphrey Lyttelton came from Eton, you know, from the Grenadier Guards, and to play jazz, this music which is minority, ethnic music, you know, and to become a master of it as well. You know, he had to make that leap of faith, and I'm glad that he did.
I mean, the first record he ever played me was Black, Brown and White, which was a song by Big Bill Broonzy, which was, you know, one of the first ever sort of protest songs.
It says, if you's white, she's all right. If you's brown, stick around. But if you's black, oh, brother, get back, get back, get back.
And that's one of those strange things that you can never really understand, is how someone from that background can actually feel in their heart, and I know he felt it in his heart, you know, to feel the passion and the justice that comes out of that music, which is born out of social injustices and you know, segregation and humiliation that he would never, ever have experienced himself.
So despite his privileged beginnings, Humph was a rebel at heart. Ever since his time spent at the steel mills in Port Talbot, Humph had been a lifelong socialist and Labour Party supporter. His personal and professional relationships were characterised by his fundamental beliefs in equality and respect for all.
All kinds of people have offered their support and help. People like Humphrey Lyttelton, who in this election is blowing our trumpet.
I first began supporting the Labour Party when it took its stand over Suez. Since then, it has consistently spoken up for people like me who regard such affairs as Cyprus, Holerkamp, Nyasaland as matters of national shame and disgrace. And that's reason enough for me to give it my full support.
But Humph was active not just in politics, but in all areas of his life. Musically, he wrote over 200 compositions, of which he said most had sunk without a trace. In 1956, however, there was an exception.
I had the record Bad Penny Blues, which I really liked, and it's got a great vibe on it, completely original. It's got that sort of thing that makes you go from side to side, which is very important. There's a lot of music that makes you do this or this, but when it goes from as that, and that's what that does very beautifully. The other thing that's amazing about Bad Penny Blues, there are no words, it's an instrumental. And I think a lot of people put words to music these days, which are pretty poor. They'd be better off not doing that, but they feel obliged to. But he was never a follower of fashion, but to have an instrumental number one in the blues style is quite amazing. I don't know actually anybody who's done it since.
It was recorded by Joe Meek, who was a fairly unorthodox recording engineer, and it was recorded in his house, and I think he used the bathroom to get the echo effect. But he got this very, very strong pounding beat, and of course it's since influenced many other people, including the Beatles with Lady Madonna.
Lady Madonna, children at your feet, wonder how you managed to make ends meet.
With Humph topping the charts, his popularity soared. But as his public fame grew, so in his personal life did his family.
For me, it was obvious that he was famous on a visit to the zoo when I was very young, and we had all these sort of young girls suddenly came running up to him asking for his autograph on the back of cigarette packets, which he gave in his normal sort of gracious way. So it was always apparent, but it never became something that was too intrusive or dominated our lives as children at all.
In fact, rather than allow his public life to intrude upon his private one, Humph made a concerted effort to maintain distance between the two.
I think it's quite difficult when you've got several families. You've got your own family, a real family. You've got your band. You've got your Clue followers. You want to keep them all separate, I think, especially in his case, and he was quite right to, I think.
None of us who knew him for many years ever had his phone number. And the story, somebody told me that if anybody leaked his phone number, he changed it. And you never minded that. You respected his privacy enormously. His family life was over there in a separate compartment. And some people, you go, oh, that's very sort. You don't behave like that with friends, not giving them your phone number. He was an exception to the rule.
Well, what's very extraordinary about Humph is that when you saw him on stage, if he was playing jazz, he gave everything. He gave all his emotions, and it seemed terribly raw and terribly... he looked rather vulnerable sometimes on the stage. But he managed that life, I think, by entirely keeping his private life private. Not that he had anything to hide. He had nothing to hide. And I admired it. I think we are in an age now where celebrity feels that they must vomit their emotions all over the rest of us. And I'm fine without, thank you very much.
It would seem then that Humph had discovered the secret to the 8-day week. Despite his often gruelling work schedule, he always found time to spend with his young family.
He would go away touring, and we would be, our mother would look after us, and then he'd return and spend extensive times with us. And we always religiously had a holiday in August.
Family holidays offered Humph a well-earned break from his daily routines, as well as an opportunity to indulge yet another of his passions.
Often our holidays would be, we would spend a lot of time birdwatching and travelling around sort of small country lanes. And my father's approach to birdwatching was one where he would be completely oblivious to any other car or pedestrian or anybody on the road. And we'd be screeching to a halt to see a shrike or a kestrel or buzzard, sort of hovering above a field or whatever. And swiftly followed by the screech of brakes behind us as a van or somebody to sort of bring it. It really was very dangerous. And my mother used to go mad at him because there was absolutely no consideration But that's because he loved it. He loved bird watching. It was an absolute passion of his, and so if there was an opportunity to show us as children, a bird that was quite rare or unusual, then he would take that opportunity and cause all sorts of mayhem.
But it was never long before Humph's trumpet called him back to the tour bus and the open road.
It was like a passport, really, to this wonderful musical world where he met all the people that he'd so admired as heroes.
The passion that he had for the instrument blew itself through the bell of the trumpet. And when you heard him, he was Humph. But I remember Louis Armstrong in 1957 on his recorded autobiography album called Humphrey the top trumpet man in Britain today, and that's a pretty hefty accolade.
Throughout his celebrated career, trumpet and movie camera to hand, Humph played and recorded with many of the jazz greats. In fact, by the end, he was able to count legends such as Buck Clayton, Big Joe Turner and Jimmy Rushing amongst his friends.
My father's primary passion obviously was music, and that was always number one in his life.
But for his family at times, Humph's trumpet playing was a mixed blessing.
The downside, I think, of having a trumpet player is that they practice at home. It would be scales and it would be bits of tunes. You wouldn't be listening to any beautiful renditions of trumpet solos. It would be short little snippets, or in some cases just screeches as he was, hitting a note or whatever.
But what the family suffered, the public gained by. On stage, Humph's playing was legendary and a salve for all.
I would say my father was happiest always on stage playing the trumpet. When the band clicked, everything went right, that was his utopia. You can see it in his eyes, and the joy, the twinkle when it's all going right.
And many times he would say to me, if I wasn't feeling well, he would say, "Don't worry, Dr. Gig will put you right." And I used to say the same to him when he was feeling a bit tired. And of course, at the end of the evening, the adrenaline and so forth, you would come off and feel much better for having done the concert.
Humph was a band leader for 60 years. He loved playing in front of audiences and was in turn loved by them.
He loved talking. He loved talking to the audience, he loved talking to anybody, he just loved talking. But he was particularly good with audiences.
He always had the audience pretty much in the palm of his hand. They'd be laughing invariably from the word go before he even opened his mouth.
If somebody came to Humphrey in the interval and bought a CD and wanted him to sign it, he would sign it in his beautiful handwriting. And he would take his time. It didn't matter how long the queue was. He would take his time, spend a little bit of time with that person, and then move on to the next one, do exactly the same with them. And if the interval was over, then he'd come back at the end of the concert and do exactly the same then. But he always looked after his fans.
Not that it ever occurred, but he would never have worried if it had been 6 people and a dog turn up. He would entertain them. He would always take Louis Armstrong's approach that one of those people may have travelled 50 or 100 miles to see you, so you give them a show. And that was his attitude. You always give people a show.
Humph's great ability in jazz was his inventiveness, his continual inventiveness. He was always coming up with something new. You never heard him play any cliches, like tired phrases that lots of people play just to get them over. We've all done it. I'm just as guilty as the next myself. But Humph somehow or other was above all that. He just played beautiful, beautiful jazz.
Humph was a great musician. He was a very, very fine trumpet player. He was a great band leader, and I would rate him as one of the masters of the British jazz scene, and indeed in the world. He was renowned all over the world. People knew him everywhere.
I looked up in a discography the other day, and I think it's true to say that Humph did indeed record every year from 1948, when he formed his band, to 2008, when he produced his last album of all. And I'm still re-exploring it. I go back to the 100 or so parlophones he made, and the late albums too. I mean, everything he recorded is tremendously good. And it's a wonderful recorded legacy.
Given Humph's success as a musician, it's perhaps ironic that for many he'll be remembered not for his jazz, but for something completely different. His chairmanship of the anarchic panel game, I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue.
We present I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, the antidote to panel games. At the piano is Colin Sell, and your chairman is Humphrey Lyttelton.
I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue was conceived in 1972 by Graham Garden and Bill Oddie as a successor to their previous radio show, I'm Sorry I'll Read That Again.
It's the only home of sheer nonsense on the radio, I think. I think we've got our own niche, or had our own niche of nonsense, of just cheerful jollity. There's nothing political about it. There's nothing unduly satirical about it. It's not commenting on anything. It's in its own mad capsule.
OK, we'll start with you, Barry and Graham. You'll be performing a scene from The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, featuring Barry as Obi-Wan Kenobi, playing Jack Worthing, and Graham as Darth Vader, playing the part of Lady Bracknell. Off you go.
I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue is an entirely unique piece of programming, and actually if you sat down and tried to analyse it, it makes no sense whatsoever. It's insane.
I have lost both my parents.
Both? That seems like carelessness.
But Humph had a great wit and love of silliness. So his left turn into the world of comedy came as no surprise to those who knew him best.
He was funny in a sort of very gentle sort of way, and he used humour a lot to try and diffuse situations. And I remember one occasion he was at Christmas, when we'd had the sort of traditional Christmas meal, and followed by the traditional Christmas row that didn't abate, and he disappeared off, only to return wearing this full Egyptian sort of jabala and fez, and a tray of champagne, and this silly grin on his face, which completely, the argument ended very quickly after that.
Clearly a natural comedian, Humph went on to chair I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue for 36 years. The job was bespoke, drawing upon his many personal and professional talents.
Well, it's time to meet the teams, and I can honestly say that you couldn't ask for 4 better comedians. So that's answered your next question.
We wanted somebody who came in from outside, really, who was like a sort of schoolmaster or a sort of uncle figure, or somebody who had a natural authority, but who knew how to play it for a laugh. And despite being at Eton and the Guards, he was a sort of character who you felt would improvise somehow around it and strike sparks off other people, or get them to strike sparks off him.
Humph's role on the show was that of an authority figure, marooned in a sea of silliness.
This is a well-established concept requiring explanation only to anyone who's slept through every show for the last 35 years. So I'll be interested to read this.
Humph somehow anchored the show, partly because he just had this extraordinary presence.
It was paternalistic, and he's there tolerating the idiot family who was sort of misbehaving and slapping them down now and again.
Listen, I'll tell you something. If I'd known at 7 o'clock in the morning on the 23rd of May, 1921, that I would ever live to sit on a stage here in Salford reading this Codswallop, I'd have turned round and crawled back in.
It's very hard to pin down what it was, but he's the only panel game chairman I've ever known who betrayed boredom and irritation.
Hang on, I think my watch has stopped. Oh no, it hasn't. Can't still be Sunday.
The team members too developed their own characters and quirks.
Okay, off you. I'll tell you another disappointing thing about this show. 15 times I've said, off you go, and then when I look up, they're still here.
My role was to be the red nose, I think, telling jokes all the time, butting in. Graham is the dry, witty one. I always think Tim's almost like the audience's representative.
Barry always bubbles and produces some wonderful stuff. Graham will always come in with a clincher, and I will just be the most talented.
Girlfriend in a coma, I know that it's serious. So girlfriend in a coma, I know.
I was the baby of the family, being only 46. And still treated very much like a newcomer, despite having been doing the show for 15 years.
And I say this in a voice laden with doom. Finally, Jeremy.
And also, of course, I couldn't sing, which was probably the only reason they've kept having me on Clue, because people seem to find it hilarious. I have such a terrible voice, which has always been a great sadness to me and an affliction.
I'm nothing special. In fact, I'm a bit of a bore. If I tell a joke, you've probably heard it before. But I have a talent, a wonderful thing, 'cause everyone listens when I start to sing. I'm so grateful and proud. All I want is to sing it out loud. So I say thank you for the music, for giving me.
Mother says I was a dancer before.
That wasn't even the same track.
Even the show's enigmatic pianist was given a role over and above accompanying the teams.
When John Naismith took over the programme, I think it was then that they decided to make mock of me, which is a very good idea.
The round is called Karaoke Koki and will be led by Colin Sell at the piano. And I must say that as an accompanist, Colin is 1 in a million. Yeah. How unlucky can you get?
Central to the show's humour was its love of wordplay and double meanings, which was a gift for someone like Humph, who'd always loved language.
He used to make us absolutely roll about with laughter. I remember one occasion, I can just see it now, him going through the drawing room door, and he just paused a moment and said, I think we'd been discussing, I think one of us had had a new puppy or something, and we were discussing names for it, and he was halfway through the door, and he turned round and said, well, when I have a dog, I think I shall call it Ceremony, so that I can tell awkward guests not to stand on him.
I think the humour of Clue is very word-based. I mean, that's for sure, and people who don't like puns will probably, not like quite a lot of the show.
And please welcome our delightful scorer, the ever-lovely Samantha.
It was the fictional Samantha who gave Humph such delight and opportunities to take the double entendre to new levels.
Oh, there's so many Samanthas. I mean, the classics like her ice cream boyfriend. There's nothing she likes more than licking the nuts off a large Neapolitan. I mean, it's just full on and joyful.
As usual, Samantha was down in the BBC Gramophone Library collecting the team's records for this. It's pitch black down there, so Samantha and the elderly archivist have taken to searching the shelves by candlelight, which can be messy. So while Samantha passes down the discs, the nice man holds the ladder while he cleans the dust and whacks off in the dark.
I just remember Humph being able to say things that we wouldn't. He just delivered it so brilliantly. It was about Samantha, who was talking to her butcher, and he wanted to know if she was interested in his beef in gravy. And she said no, she'd prefer his tongue inside her. Now, what was wonderful about that was the Times quoted it, and on their website, I don't know, it was on the page, it actually was inside her. It came through some editor and put it right. But Humph delivered a line like that. I couldn't do that.
Oh, well, I'm afraid it doesn't look as if Samantha's going to be able to make it for this half of the evening, at least. I'm afraid she's had to stop off to see a grumpy old gentleman friend in Stockport who doesn't like spending his money. He's been phoning her constantly, angrily demanding a visit. Samantha says she really doesn't mind handling his testy calls, and she says that... She says if she butters him up properly, she can occasionally get him to splash out. Oh.
Now, they're funny gags, but when you then have them said by Humph, and the joy of sitting on the panel and hearing the audience go, wow, because it was absolute filth. I mean, it really was.
Ill. I felt ill, and Humph would then look at you in mock horror that you had ever thought he meant to be rude in any way. It's wonderful.
Oh, dear. We've just received this note from Samantha to say she's been held up again. She's agreed to meet up with a gentleman friend at the Midland Hotel where he's laying on a tasting of French white wines. She's hoping there'll be a better selection than last year when she was disappointed he had only a Semillon. But thought it would be impolite not to taste it anyway.
I'd put him up there with the great timers, you know, like Jack Benny and Eric Morecambe. Oh yes, he had a great comedian's timing. It was amazing.
I think there are times in the show when you'd feel that Humph was at home verbally, because musically he would be able to take a theme and then go off with it somewhere and not worry that he didn't know where he was going. And that, of course, was incredibly true of Clue.
He had the jazzman's instinct of sometimes laying back on the beat, so the punchline came a little bit after you expected it, or pressed it forward and it came a bit sooner. So he would always surprise his audience. They perhaps might even know what punchline he was working towards, but they never knew quite when he would get to it.
Most musicians, but very much jazzers, seem to hit it off with us, the comedy people, because you're all riffing and improvising. It's part of what you do, and their skill, which I admire enormously, is obviously musical. But we always get on well because we're doing the same thing with words, I suppose. And Humph, as a great lover of words, discovered a world where not only was he playing his trumpet with people he liked and joining in the music, but he loved the humour and he loved the anecdotes.
Our next round takes as its subject the art of love and romance. Now, normally, I don't approve of the teams prizing fun out of such a subject. Making love isn't something to be mocked. It's the most tender, beautiful thing that money can buy.
He would play these gags with just as much skill and timing as he would his instrument, you know, and that was delightful to witness.
I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue turned Humph into a major radio personality, but he never relinquished his first love, his love of jazz.
BBC Radio 2.
This is Humphrey Lyttelton with the best part of an hour of jazz between now and 10 o'clock.
Despite his commitments to the band, and I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, Humph undertook a new role, hosting The Best of Jazz. Through this, Humph was able to share his encyclopedic knowledge of the music with a receptive new audience.
Every art form needs a communicator. And I once called Humphrey the greatest communicator and standard bearer for the music. And he was remarkable in that although his personal tastes probably hovered back to the traditional end of the music, he was totally open to every kind of jazz that was broadcast, from avant-garde to traditional classic jazz. And I think that's what made him the great communicator, the great standard bearer, the person you could always rely on to say, do, or play the right thing.
What I try to do with this program is to make it not like a pundit talking to jazz students and so on, because that's a disastrous thing to try and do anyway, because anybody who knows a jazz enthusiast will know that he is his own pundit. His record collection is the one, and he doesn't want anybody telling him what to get.
Humphrey had the knack, I think, of all great broadcasters of just appearing to talk to one person, the person who was listening at the other end of the radio.
I think because Humphrey Lyttelton was such a fantastic player, such a studied gentleman, it came across in the show. You know, if he took it seriously, then so should I.
A weekly broadcast on Radio 2, Humph hosted the best of jazz for 40 years, in this time hand-picking each record for airplay.
The way I do this program, in order to get this element of surprise for me, I don't like playing records that I know backwards anyway, is to put an LP on the turntable right at the start, beginning of track 1, and then I start the stopwatch going. Where are we? And then I just let it run and carry on with all the other things that I do, tidying up the room or feeding the moths. And any track on the LP that hits me when I'm doing all these different things is the one which I'm likely to choose, because after all, the people who are listening to a record program are people who are probably washing up. They might even be feeding moths or covering things with wet tissue paper. And the track that gets through to me is going to be the one that's going to get through to them.
I always heard an amazing record that I'd never heard before, and it might have been one that was 5 minutes old that had just been made, or it might have been one that was 75 years old. You know, but he had this. He was constantly searching at the song face and finding different little gems. You know.
Some of the joys of working with him is his enthusiasm would be infectious with the music. He'd throw his pen in the air, he'd throw an ashtray in the air or a script, whatever came to hand, and he'd just live the music, even though he would have heard the record 20, 30, 40 years ago, and probably on a monthly basis since then. And it was almost as if he was hearing it for the first time. It was extraordinary how the music had this capacity to move him, and he had the capacity to then explain that to the audience, which is perhaps one of the secrets of his broadcasting success.
On his show, Humphrey Lyttelton was to jazz what John Peel had been to the indie sector.
One of the things that Humphrey Lyttelton liked to do on The Best of Jazz was to play new talent. He said it was one of the most exciting things that he actually did on the show was to give the first airing to people's talents.
He was somebody who championed the works of the younger musicians. And it wasn't just a matter of, you know, hi, I'm a blonde vocalist and I'm on a major label, here's my CD, tell people about it. He would go for the unknown person. He would go for the person playing at the pub in Dalston, you know, and present that work as important as the one that was on a major label.
One such unsigned artist that got a helping hand from Humph was Stacey Kent, the now widely acclaimed jazz vocalist.
I had sent him a demo, basically, when I got to this country. I didn't send out many demos, but I sent it to Humphrey Lyttelton, the voice of Radio 2. And I sent it out on a Monday, and on the Thursday I got a phone call, and of course I knew this voice so well. Hello, is Stacey Kent there? And I said, yes, this is Stacey Kent. Who is this, please? But I knew exactly who it was. And he said, this is Humphrey Lyttelton. I'd like you to listen to my show on Monday. And proceeded to tell me about the demo that I had sent him and what he had listened to. Of course, I was hugely honored, just knocked out. And the fact that he was playing my demo, which wasn't a published album at this point, was also pretty wonderful.
But Humph's helping hand would often extend outside of the studio, and he would invite these young, unknown artists to play in his band, catapulting them to success in the jazz world.
When I made the demo, I wasn't really gigging at all. I was very new in London. You know, it was a fantastic break. I went from having like 4 or 5 gigs a year to being pretty busy playing in theatres and, you know, learning how it all works very quickly. So if I hadn't met Humph, I probably would be struggling now. I may even be doing a proper job, I guess.
He was always waxing lyrically about a young artist's efforts. And that's inspiring because apparently when you're older, you hate everything young. And when you're younger, you hate everything old. But he was one of those guys that crossed that barrier line.
Humph's expansive interest in a wide range of music earned him an unexpected invitation when in 2002 Radiohead, one of the most successful bands in recent history, asked him to play with them.
I think they got in touch with Humph and they said they'd like his band on one of their tracks, and they played him the track. And Humph said to them, "I hear a New Orleans funeral march," or should I say New Orleans funeral march here. And they said, "Great, come into the studio and let's put it down."
Humph working with Radiohead was great because Radiohead are brilliant and they have the same view of music that Humph had, which is an open mind and just trying to make the thing work. And, you know, sometimes people imagine that people are from different worlds, but once good musicians start playing together, they realise they're all serving the same God, which is that of the song, whichever they're playing, and that's what Humph was able to do.
I think what he found I think what he found strange was initially that they would have known of him and have known enough about what he did for them to think that he could add something to one of their albums. They don't need any kudos from anybody. They're kind of pretty famous in their own right. But I think the fact that they knew of him and knew of his music, and then felt that his music would be compatible with what they were doing, was a whole excitement for Humphrey. And yes, he enjoyed the experience very much.
Humph, still impressive at 80, exceeded all expectations for a man of his age.
I never once thought about his age. It never came up. He was just a boy having a laugh. And you could see him from his early days of practising in a pub in North London. You could see that joy, that joie de vivre, had never, ever left him.
You thought of him as being extremely mature and an institution, but there was an unreality about him being in his 80s. And I think that was the charisma of the man. You didn't think of him like that.
There was a moment when he suddenly said, "I've just been reading in the paper that if you're tall, you don't live as long." And he turned to me, who was quite a bit smaller than him, and said, "Which I really resent with you, Tim." And I thought, well, and I actually said in front of the audience, if I live to be 86, then I will settle for it. Thank you very much indeed. And may you go on for a long time. But it was one of those things that he thought, the whole point of my remark was I'd like to be like you at any age. Doesn't matter what age you are. And he only used age as a means for humour at the end.
But Humph, still sharp as a tack, was about to embark upon another adventure when in 2007, I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue took to the road for a 6-month tour of the UK.
I think what happened on tour was that it was more like his jazz, I suppose, that he was playing tunes that he was familiar with, and that the script had been, the same for almost every show. But he would find new little ways of delivering it, new moments, new timings, finding a different rhythm in a piece, and also just would look at the words and, famously suddenly announce to the audience that stratagem was megatarts backwards, which he'd just noticed.
There was a big difference between Humph doing the recordings for radio and Humph on tour, because on tour, he's suddenly got this gleam in his eye. He'd skip on to... I said, you're not meant to be enjoying yourself. And by the end, he was like he'd shed 40 years, and I'd like a copy of that Humph.
Up on stage, Humph was in his element.
It was just a joy to see him on stage. And when he caught your eye, I mean, it was like God smiling at you, you know, just he'd look around and he'd look at you to see how you were reacting to one of his jokes, and then he'd smile and just twinkle, and you just your heart would melt, you know, you couldn't help but just love Humph, you know.
As the tour drew to its close, it was clear it had been a massive success. People had turned out in their thousands to see the show and hear their idol, Chairman Humph, then 86, play his legendary trumpet finale.
There was a moment when Humph at the end plays We'll Meet Again on his trumpet, and he would hit a high note. And on a couple of occasions he hadn't hit the high note, and I would tease him afterwards and say, you worked your way around, you got away with it. But he hits that high note, and I'd just like him to know that at the time, I just thought that is about as good as it gets. And well done.
Humph never stopped working right up until the end, recording albums, writing books, touring with Clue and gigging with his band.
I never saw a single moment where he started to slow down, and his manager, Susan, was always trying to get him to eat a bit more and sit down a bit more and have a cup of tea. But he would stand and pace around in the green room and tell us jokes and anecdotes, and he was just brimming with vitality.
Up until only a few weeks before he died, he would drive to all his own gigs, and on top of the driving he would go up and do the sound check. Then he would play a 1-hour set and go out in the interval and sign CDs and talk to the public. So he was getting no break, and then he'd do another hour set, then drive back to the hotel. And that's astonishing when you think of how tiring that is.
However, in April 2008, fears grew for Humph's health when he was admitted to hospital for surgery to repair an aortic aneurysm.
When he went in for his what was to be the final operation, I don't think any of us thought he was going to die, because it seemed impossible that you could blow out such an incredibly vibrant light.
But at his age, Humph's chances of recovery from such a serious operation were slim.
I have to say I was very concerned about him going in for the operation, because I knew that a major op with an anaesthetic, general anaesthetic, at the age of 86, is not something to undertake lightly, and probably he would come out of it diminished in some way. He would not be the same man he was before. He would have hated convalescence, I know that. It may have meant the end of his trumpeting, which would have been unbearable for him.
The day before he was going to have his operation, we all went to see him, and my children, his grandchildren were there, and he talked at length to my daughter Lucy about how the operation was going to go, and what was being done, and explained why it had to happen and everything. And at the end of it, he turned to her and he said, "And when that's done, I'll live forever."